Okay, good morning, everyone. It is 9:01 in lovely Vancouver, BC, and we have a jam-packed hour in front of us. So let's go ahead and get started with our special Fraud Prevention Month webinar. First off, a little bit of housekeeping. If you do have any questions, just use the Q&A tab at the bottom of your Zoom. I'm sure everybody's familiar with that, and we will get to your questions either at the end of the session, or if we run out of time, we will for sure follow up with you. So I would like to thank everyone, first of all, for coming today. I know we had registrants from literally all over the globe. So there's obviously quite a lot of interest in the topic. And of course there is. I mean, everybody on here knows that employee fraud is a costly issue that impacts businesses of all industries and all sizes. And yes, of course, external threats represent a portion of that risk, but more times than not, the threat comes within, hence the title of our webinar. So we are super excited and privileged to welcome Risk and Forensics Expert and Grant Thornton LLP partner Caroline Dixon, who will be joined by our very own product marketing manager now, Christy Cuthbert. So you'll excuse me for a moment here. I'm going to cut to a script because Caroline is probably the most decorated guest speaker we have ever had, and I want to make sure I get her credentials right. So Caroline is a qualified chartered professional accountant and a designated specialist in investigative and forensic accounting with over 20 years experience in public accounting. She specializes in forensic accounting, investigative and litigation support, and has conducted a wide range of anti-fraud work for financial services, healthcare, education, construction, not-for-profit, government, and other public sector corporations. Caroline, I hope I got all that right. So with all of that said, I will now hand it over to Caroline to introduce herself and get things started.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the lovely introduction. It's great to be here. It is Fraud Prevention Month, as Ian just mentioned, and this is a really important topic. It continues to be an important topic, and with everything going on in the world today, it's just getting more and more crazy out there. So it's really good that we're taking the time to speak about all of this. It's creating the fraud awareness in your workplace for you as an individual, but for your organization as well as a whole. So very excited to be here. As Ian mentioned, my name is Caroline Dixon. I'm a partner in the Risk and Forensic Services group with Grant Thornton. And I've been doing this type of work for a lot of years. I'm an accountant, but a forensic accountant. I specialize in fraud investigations, basically helping anybody with any sort of situation where money has been stolen or suspected of being stolen, any sort of assets stolen from the company. I help navigate clients through these difficult times. So I've got some good stories to share, some statistics to share, and yeah, hopefully for the next hour, I'll keep you entertained. And it's wonderful to be working with you again, Christy. We have worked together in the past, so it's nice to be presenting with you today. So our agenda today, we'll talk about workplace fraud. So what is occupational fraud or workplace fraud? What is it, and what are the different ways that fraud is committed, and how can we all work together to prevent fraud from occurring, or at least try to keep the prevention rate, try to keep the fraud rate lower in an organization? How do we create that awareness and work together to prevent fraud? And finally, at the end, Christy will be talking about how to use your intranet as a fraud prevention tool. And as mentioned, we will be taking questions as well. So I think there's a chat function where you can ask questions, and hopefully we'll have some time to address those as we go through. So to start off, I think probably you're all aware what fraud is, but just as a reminder, we'll sort of take it back to the basics, just to make sure we're all on the same page getting started here. So we're talking today about internal fraud, occupational fraud, fraud in your workplace. And as mentioned, there is the external threat as well, and we will definitely touch on that because it is such a hot topic. There's a lot of the cybersecurity type fraud happening as well, cyber fraud happening. So we will get into that as well. But to start off, we're going to focus on occupational fraud, and that's the fraud happening in your workplace where somebody is intentionally deceiving, misusing organizations' resources or assets for their own personal gain. And really, there's a lot of different types of fraud in the workplace, the top one being asset misappropriation. We'll get into all of that in a little bit, but really just wanted to start with that definition. And if we go on to the next slide, I'm sure some of you, or probably all of you, have seen this before, this fraud triangle. And again, it's really, I just wanted to start with the basics, with the foundation of how fraud is being committed. What are the key things that are driving people to commit fraud in the workplace? So in this fraud triangle diagram up on the screen, you can see the opportunity at the top. We've got the pressure, the rationalization, and all of these things sort of working together with an individual who's committing fraud in the workplace. If you think about the opportunities, you know, where are the control gaps in your organization? Where's a place where somebody could commit fraud? And if you think about the pressures, maybe this individual is living beyond their means and they really need some more money. You know, they have a gambling problem or some other addiction problem. So there's this pressure to need to obtain more money from your organization. And then combined with the weak controls, they can commit the fraud. And then they rationalize, oh, you know, it's only a loan, I'm going to pay it back, I've been working hard, I deserve it. So all of these things coming together really are the key drivers of fraud in the workplace, or any fraud, actually. We've all seen lately the headlines. You know, there's just so much fraud in the workplace and in general right now. I feel like every day there's some news headline about cybersecurity breaches. You know, there's been hacks, there's so much going on. So this is really just a great slide to illustrate. These are all recent news articles, and there's just so much of it happening right now. You know, you see Saskatoon man charged with $1.1 million workplace fraud theft. There's just, yeah, I feel like lately, and especially since COVID, we've just been dealing with so much, and every day there's just something else in the news. So this is just to give you an idea of how much it is happening. It's a huge problem. Again, going back to the fraud triangle, as I just mentioned, you know, with everything that's going on in our world today, it really is the perfect storm for fraud. So again, thinking about the internal controls in your organization and the pressures and the opportunities, if you look at this slide, what I'm trying to illustrate here is that with all the craziness that's going on in the world, you know, we've had a global pandemic, we now have a war, we've got just so much happening all around that people have really taken their eyes off some of the important things in the organization. So the internal controls perhaps in your organization are going down. You can see that in the middle of the screen there. But on the sides of the triangle there, you've got these pressures and the opportunities going up, which creates this, like I said, the perfect storm. We've got, at the beginning of the pandemic, we had, you know, organizations with cutbacks because they just couldn't afford to pay staff. So we've got the cutbacks, and then all of this money being pumped in from the government and extra money, and so people rehiring, but we also have people looking for changes because they're just, you know, they're tired of working for the same organization during COVID, so there's people leaving. So that it creates these gaps in your organization where employees maybe are doing more but with less budget. There's staffing shortages, there's people working in siloed teams from home, there's this lack of management oversight. So all of these things, plus the outdated processes and technology, which is a huge problem, all of these things just being mixed together, and with the controls kind of being at the low priority in an organization, just creating this perfect storm for fraud. So fraud has been on the rise since COVID has hit. This slide just shows the current reality. So on the top of the screen here are some statistics from the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners. And this is from their 2020 report to the nations. Every 2 years, the ACFE puts out this fraud report. And what you can see here is that 5% of revenue is lost each year from a typical organization to fraud. The median loss per case is $125,000. The average loss per case is $1.5 million. So it's a huge problem, and it's not going away. A typical fraud case lasts about 14 months before being detected. So it's going on kind of behind the scenes. Nobody knows it's happening. And this causes an average loss of $8,300 per month. And you know, if you think about it, if there's fraud happening in your organization and it's going on for this long and you don't know, it's just a huge problem. And you think about it, so these are the internal fraud statistics, but if you think about it from an external threat as well, you know, like the cybersecurity threats, if somebody is hacking into your systems and kind of there behind the scenes without you knowing for perhaps a year, 12 months, just watching what your organization is doing, it's really a scary thought to think of what information they could be getting their hands on. The statistics on the lower part of the screen here are actually coming from a recent Grant Thornton survey report that has been put out in conjunction with the ACFE. So Grant Thornton has produced this survey report called The Next Normal, Preparing for a Post-Pandemic Fraud Landscape. And it really is a good survey if you are interested in it. We can certainly circulate these documents with you after if they'd be helpful. But the survey is showing that 51% of organizations have uncovered more fraud since the onset of the pandemic, as I was just mentioning earlier. And 71% expect the level of fraud impacting their organizations to increase over the next year. So there really is that expectation that it's just going to get worse. So I think what we're doing here today is just great, that we're creating the awareness. And I think the more you can do that for yourself personally and for your organization is just going to be really key to know what scams are out there and how you can protect yourself. So here you can see the profile of a workplace fraudster. And this again is from the ACFE 2020 report to the nation. So you can see that the older fraudsters cause much larger median losses. So 55 plus cause losses of $425,000. You can see males committed more frauds and caused higher losses, which is really interesting. If we do this in person, I like to have everybody stand up in the room and sort of call out the statistics of male versus female ages and see who's left standing. And those are the typical fraudsters. We can't do that, obviously, as we're doing this virtually, but it is interesting to see the split here. And the education is interesting as well. So 64% of occupational fraudsters had a university degree or higher. And it really makes sense. It's the individuals that have been with the organizations the longest. They have more opportunity to commit fraud because they've worked their way up in an organization and probably have more access to things in an organization. You know, they have the access to accounts payable or to approve expenses or things without other people noticing. So they've been around the longest. Occupational fraudsters who had been with their organizations at least 6 years caused twice the loss of less tenured employees. Every time I'm investigating a fraud, I find that people are always surprised as to who the perpetrator is. You know, it's like somebody they trusted, somebody who worked really hard and has been around in the organizations for such a long period of time. And I'm not suggesting that you shouldn't trust people, but it is typically that person that just works every weekend, works evenings, and just, you know, never takes a vacation that is causing some sort of fraud in your organization. So as I touched on a little bit already, the common risk areas are up on the screen here. And as I mentioned, asset misappropriation is still the #1 risk area of fraud. And you think about it, it's sort of the easiest type of fraud to commit, right? You think about somebody stealing inventory from an organization, or there's cash in the cash register and taking it and putting it in their pocket. You know, there's a physical asset that somebody is stealing a lot of the time, right? And if it could be inventory, it could be cash, like I said, but then there's also opportunities for people to fabricate expenses. So there's the purchasing, the payroll fraud, those sort of things. So that all falls under the bucket of asset misappropriation. And when you think about your physical security in your organization as well, like that's kind of where there could be a threat for somebody stealing something from your organization. But on top of that, it could be intellectual property as well, or confidential data that you have in your organization that somebody wants to use for their own personal gain or to sell to others. So asset misappropriation is still the #1 type of fraud that's being committed. The other two, three on the left-hand side of the screen there, we're talking about corruption, still a big problem. That you think about bribery and corruption and people in positions of power just misusing that power for personal gain or colluding with others. Financial statement fraud, also a big problem. It's not as common as asset misappropriation, but when it does occur, the dollar value loss is much higher. So something to be aware of. And then number 4 there, we see the cybersecurity and external threats. So the asset misappropriation, the corruption, the financial statement fraud typically are internal to your organization, but coupled with that, we really have to pay attention to those external threats because they are on the rise. They have gotten so much worse since the pandemic has started and are predicted to just get even worse. So we really do need to keep our eye on those sort of scams that are happening. The highest risk industries are listed up here on the screen as well. You can see the top 5 I have listed here: banking and financial services, government and public administration, manufacturing, healthcare, and energy. But we really are seeing the problem across all industries. So don't think that if you're not on this list that you're immune, because you in no way are. I think what we're seeing is the reality is it's across all industries and it's happening to everybody. So you really have to pay attention. So how is workplace fraud committed? As I touched on already a couple of times, asset misappropriation is really the number one area, the number one way of fraud is committed. So it's really just the theft or misuse of assets from your organization. And if you think about sales and cash, it's anywhere in that sales cycle where somebody could get access to money that they shouldn't. So you think about sales coming in the door. If there is, I know a lot of organizations don't accept or don't have as much cash these days, but if you do accept cash, there is still that opportunity for somebody to put their hand in the till and take cash. And whether they put the cash in their pocket before it's recorded in the books and records, sort of the skimming off the top, or once it's already into the books and records and then manipulating the accounting records to hide what they've done. We're still seeing lots of this sort of traditional type fraud. Just maybe issuing more credit memos to hide out what they're doing, reversing transactions, voiding transactions. We still are seeing check tampering, believe it or not, and intercepting of wires and changing the account numbers of where a wire is going. I've still seen lots of this. So lately, or recently, I was working on a case where there's an individual in the accounts payable department who she had been given too much control. So she was the one getting the checks prepared, the wires prepared, and then also the one that was approving and sending the wires. And she also had access to change the banking account information on where the wire was being transferred to. So she was able to change the bank account information and have the wire transfer go to her own account. So over a 12-month period, she stole $900,000. And it wasn't until the customer that they were paying or the vendor that they were paying actually said, why haven't I been paid? Eventually caught up. But then you see at the top of the screen here that lapping scenario where perhaps she's borrowing money from one, she eventually pays that off with somebody else, but it's sort of like a continuous flow where you're stealing money from one, you're paying to yourself, and then you're constantly catching up, trying to cover up your track. So that lapping of the money. So still these sort of traditional type of frauds are happening. And then on the bottom of the screen here, you can see on the expenditures and payments, I've seen lots of cases of fraudulent vendors and falsified invoices. There's one case in particular that sticks out in my mind where the guy that was committing the fraud was fabricating invoices, fabricating contracts, and they were for a company that he owned, but people didn't realize he was the owner of the company. He was in an IT role, fabricated a contract about these IT things that nobody really understood what they meant anyway. So he had all of this, he was just able to kind of pull the wool over everybody's eyes because nobody really understood what the contract was for, and people trusted him in his position as an IT manager. And he told them, yes, we need this. He approved it, but didn't realize the other people didn't realize it was actually going to him, to his own company and his own bank account. So any sort of this sort of manipulation, misuse of company assets are what we're talking about here. And expense schemes, still a big problem. And again, nothing new here. You've probably heard lots about these type of scams happening before, but still, I don't know, we're hired a lot to do these type of investigations still. I've seen people put through personal trips, plastic surgery, jewelry on corporate credit cards. Like, it's crazy what they can get away with if nobody's watching. You know, these cases, in these cases, the individual had a corporate credit card and it was just kind of getting paid on a monthly basis, and nobody was checking to see what was on the corporate credit card. So plastic surgery actually got put through, and trips to Jamaica and all these things, and nobody noticed. I've also seen altered receipts, obviously made up expenses, double dipping. I've seen cases where they've overstated the mileage and kilometer rates as well, or they've put in claims for mileage, but they were also getting allowances for travel as well. So they're doing the sort of double dipping. And all of these things are still a big problem, and something to look out for in your organization. And then payroll fraud, also still a big problem. Obviously, if anybody's sort of changing details on a timesheet, that's a problem. If nobody's independently reviewing or just kind of signing off on it without really checking, it could be a problem. So there's a case recently where an individual's mother-in-law was the one who was approving the timesheet, and was just kind of turning a blind eye that he would show up late and leave early, and just approving blindly the times that were on the timesheet. So any sort of like inappropriate approvals or doctoring of timesheet. Seen problems with falsified contracts as well. There was an individual whose son was hired for a summer program, but then went back to university and wasn't removed off of the payroll. So there was a falsified contract. There was a fake contract in place for the time period when the individual was actually not even in the same town, had gone back to university, but had been left on the payroll, and the checks were still going to the family. So I'm not clear in this case if the son was involved or if it was just the father kind of getting his hands on the paycheck. But if you have anybody on your payroll records as a ghost employee, you know, so they're not actually there, they're not working, but they're still getting paid, and perhaps you're changing that banking information so that it's going to you or a family member. We've also seen cases where pay rates have been manipulated. If you have access to change the pay rates or give yourself a pay increase and nobody's checking or approving, it could be a problem. And anything related to payroll, you know, if you think about commissions, if they're based on sales, people have the opportunity to overstate the sales or do the calculation wrong so that they get paid more. So commissions or bonuses, benefits and vacations, just not recording these things properly. These are all things to definitely watch out for. And then when you think about the data in your organization as well, there's definitely a threat there. And this, we'll start talking about external threats as well, but really it could be internal. If you think about for your organization where your most valued assets are, what data do you have that's important? What confidential information could be stolen or misused? It's really important to start thinking about, if you haven't already, how secure is it? Have you done sort of an IT health check to understand if people can hack into your systems, or somebody internally has access to something that they shouldn't have? Making sure that you understand how secure it is. And there is that, like I said, there is that external threat as well, and people selling this data on the dark web. So definitely a newer sort of threat to think about. I mean, not newer over the last few years, but if I think back to the start of my career in forensics, you know, this wasn't such a big issue, but now has really become front and center and something to watch out for. And so that gets into the cyber fraud, these external threats. You've probably all heard of business email compromise fraud by now, but really what it is those emails that you get that look like they're from somebody in your organization, maybe the CEO in your organization, and it's an email that's trying to trick you into clicking a link or opening an attachment or something so that they can then gain access into your systems and steal whatever it is they're looking for, whether it's money or your data, or gain access to your online banking. I did see a case like that as well, where there was an individual who received one of these business email compromise, one of these emails, and it looked like it was coming from a bank, but there was an attachment, and when she opened the attachment, it put malware on her computer, and they were watching what she was doing, and they saw that she was she logged into her banking system, and they were able to gain access and steal money. In one transaction, they stole $90,000, and it was just a small organization. So this is more, getting into sort of the phishing emails that you see as well. So you can see up on the screen here, we've got hacking, ransomware, malware, phishing, like all of these terms you've probably heard, and maybe you're not totally familiar with all of them, but anytime somebody is sending an email pretending to be somebody else in an attempt to get you to give up some secure information by clicking on a link or opening an attachment, they're trying to trick you into believing something. And a lot of times they'll say, this is urgent, we need you to do this right away. And in the business email compromise fraud, they're pretending to be somebody in your organization, someone specific that you know, and maybe they've just changed the email address slightly to trick you. In the phishing scams, they're more generic. You kind of get an email that everybody else is getting the same email. It's not specific to you. It's not really personalized, but they're really hoping just to fool a few people to get them to click on a link. The spear phishing ones are more targeted, and they know a little bit about you, and it actually, when you open up the email, seems like, okay, this could be real. But just always think, just slow down, take the time, slow down, think about what you're reading. Does it make sense? If it feels a little bit weird, it probably isn't to be trusted, and you should really not. I don't know. I'm in the habit now of just really not trusting any emails that I get. I double check the email addresses, who it's coming from. If I'm not sure, I pick up the phone and call somebody. And yeah, just making sure you're not putting your organization at risk is really, really important. So how is workplace fraud concealed? So you can see here that 40% of fraudsters created fraudulent physical documents, 36% altered physical documents, 27% altered electronic documents, and 26% created fraudulent electronic documents. So there's lots of different ways of doing it. And I was working on a file recently where I was actually really surprised that the individual had altered physical documents. So that 36% stat there, we had an individual who had actually cut and taped with tape, not like an electronic document where you can kind of make it look more professional, had used scissors and tape and doctored financial statements and then scanned it. And you could see in the scanned copy that it wasn't even straight. It was kind of taped on a little offside, and and they've used the same logo to fabricate financial statements for multiple years. And you could see the same mistakes on multiple years of documents. And they put the wrong header of a financial statement on the wrong type of financial. It was just a mess. So it's interesting to think that fraudsters are still using these sort of old-fashioned means of committing fraud. But in the altered electronic documents, it's also quite interesting because we were able to see, if it's a PDF, we can edit the document. We can sort of dig into the metadata behind the document to see when it was created and who's edited it. And you can see sort of the attempt to overlay images on top of images or create and doctor electronic documents. So it's interesting to see all the different ways that people are committing fraud, but most of the time we can see that they have been doctored. So how is workplace fraud detected? The number one way is still by tip. You can see at the top of the screen here that fraud is detected by tip 43% of the time. And this has been the number one way for years. So I'll get into this a little bit just in a couple of slides, but you think about having a good whistleblower hotline in place in your organization. Like, it's really important. Like, I can't emphasize it enough. If you've got some way that individuals in your organization can express concerns, if they see anything going wrong, they have a means to report it. It's so important. If it's a whistleblower hotline that's managed by a third party that they feel comfortable using, that they know would be anonymous if they want to be anonymous, it really is a no-brainer to put a whistleblower hotline in place in your organization. And you can see here that who's reporting the occupational fraud. Employees are reporting 50% of the time. So sometimes organizations will open up their hotlines to customers and vendors and other people that they're doing business with. Sometimes organizations will just choose to have it just for their employees, but it is really important. Employees are the #1 way that tips are being provided to organizations so that they know that something is going on. And these are just some red flags to watch out for. I feel like a lot of the time when we're investigating a fraud, after the fact, somebody says, well, I was wondering how so-and-so, how that person was driving a fancy car, how they were going on all these fancy vacations. It doesn't make sense that, in the role that they had access to all these extra funds. So definitely keep an eye out for anybody living beyond their means. Maybe they have financial difficulties. Maybe there's like a gambling problem or something going on, or debt problems. If you see any sort of unusually close relationships with vendors or customers, that sometimes could be a red flag. The control issues is also a one that we see a lot. I was afraid to speak up because this individual was kind of a control freak, wanted to make sure that he or she had control of everything in the process, and I was afraid to say anything. They sort of had this bully attitude, and I was afraid to say anything. So any sort of some of these red flags, these are things to keep an eye out for. They're not necessarily guaranteed that there's fraud going on, but definitely something to question. And again, if you had the whistleblower hotline in place in your organization, if you had something that wasn't sitting quite right with you, you had that opportunity to speak up anonymously, that would be really good as well. Did we just skip ahead here? I think we did. Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about fraud prevention now. So I'm almost done. I'm going to pass things over to Christy pretty quickly here, but I do want to make sure that you're armed with some good ideas of how to prevent fraud from happening in your workplace. So I think I've touched on it a little bit at the start of this presentation, but doing fraud awareness training is so important. As we were talking about, it is Fraud Prevention Month. We're trying to create this awareness of fraud and all the different types of scams that are out there. And it needs to be done on a regular basis in your organization. It needs to be something that you're talking about, and that you're making it okay to share stories, and you're helping create that awareness with all of your coworkers and colleagues. So having the fraud awareness training, the statistics they do show that if you have the training in your organization, you're more likely to uncover a fraud. Like the likelihood of detection by tip increases. People know what to look out for. They know how to report it. They've got that training, so they're more likely to give your hotline or somebody in your organization a tip so that you can uncover a fraud sooner. And you can see up here, so the whistleblower hotline, so I've talked about this a few times already, but that training coupled with a whistleblower hotline is just really important. The organizations with hotlines detected fraud more quickly, so there's a shorter time period. They were able to find out that the fraud was happening, and the losses that they were incurring were much lower as well. So without a hotline, bigger losses, and it took way longer to, I guess 6 months longer, I shouldn't say way longer, but longer to uncover. So definitely having a hotline in place is a great fraud prevention tool and detection tool. So a few other fraud prevention techniques are listed up here on the screen as well, but it's really about being proactive and creating that zero tolerance for fraud in your organization, that culture, that mindset. If you can, it would be great to do a fraud risk assessment. And that really means like looking at your controls in your organization, looking at where your threats are in comparison to your controls, and figuring out where you may have gaps in your organization where a fraud could happen. And doing this fraud risk assessment on a regular basis, don't just do it once and forget about it. Keep looking at it probably annually, at least annually, and making sure that you're updating it for people maybe coming and going, different changes in your controls, and then looking at it in terms of the bigger fraud risk management program in your organization as well. So your fraud risk assessment, but like what policies do you have in place to deal with fraud? Who's going to be involved when a fraud occurs? What are your reporting mechanisms? What are your investigative procedures? And again, as I said, creating that culture of, it's okay to talk about fraud and we're not going to tolerate it, and making sure that everybody in your organization is aware of that. I've also got up here doing background checks and due diligence on new employees and vendors, also a great way to prevent fraud from happening, making sure you're getting the right people in the door. The increased coordination and collaboration across the organization is really key. And I know Christy's going to get into more of that now on the next few slides. But again, it's really about being proactive and creating that awareness, and just working together to try and keep the fraud down in your organization.
Thank you so
I'm
much.
going to turn it over to Christy.
Yeah. Yeah, thanks so much, Caroline. As Caroline mentioned, we have worked together on quite a few fraud initiatives over the years, and we're so happy for her to join us today and explore a bit of a different angle. So I'm going to be talking about how to use your intranet as a powerful fraud prevention tool. When we think of an intranet, what comes to mind is probably something like you see here, an internal hub that houses company news, blogs, maybe employee profiles, and some announcements. I can make a safe bet that fraud prevention probably does not come to mind, but I'm hoping today that, that we can change that. So why is your intranet a powerful fraud prevention tool? Well, it serves as your business's single source of truth by ensuring related fraud documents and announcements are up to date and accessible to employees within a single channel, as opposed to spread across multiple channels like email, your network, or potentially someone's desktop. This not only protects data, but also helps to build a community and shared vision around fraud prevention. It also enables effective communication and collaboration, which is something I think every business really struggles with to some degree. And this has obviously become an even greater challenge since COVID. An intranet really makes it easy for employees to engage by enabling top down, bottom up, and two-way communication, so they feel connected to the business and to each other. It's really hard to consistently validate data and information when you're using physical forms and email-based or manual workflows. And this also creates opportunities for falsifying information and documents, which Caroline mentioned earlier. And physical documents are also harder to track. So an intranet allows you to create smart forms and automated workflows that are trackable and auditable. So you can easily validate the information you're receiving and go back and make sure that all the boxes are checked and everything lines up. Finally, an intranet allows you to run content and site audit reports, and also run surveys and quizzes and polls to assess fraud awareness levels on an ongoing basis, so you can intervene quickly without any delays. So let's dive into some examples of what this looks like. So fraud awareness training is really important, and it lays the foundation for fraud awareness across the organization. But it's not a one and done deal. It's really something that you need to keep up. Since most fraud is discovered from or reported from employee tips, maintaining awareness with ongoing reminders and news and announcements is really critical. Creating a fraud hub within your intranet is a great way to share policy updates, alerts, training materials, testing results. Some of our customers also report on recent fraud incidents by using generalized details, so employees can focus on the risks and not who was potentially involved. Something like this I know it can feel overwhelming. It sounds like a lot of content, a lot of work, but you can also use external content and resources to boost fraud awareness. Case studies from similar industries are a great way to help employees connect to the content. And I know the ACFE, which Caroline mentioned earlier, has some incredible fraud awareness content and videos that you can share on your hub to keep employees educated and always ensure fraud is top of mind. But how do you know all of this is effectively boosting fraud awareness? So you can use your intranet to assess fraud awareness. For example, as you see here, you can create and distribute surveys. You can create more lighthearted polls and assign periodic quizzes to really get a grasp of fraud awareness levels across the organization. These are really great and valuable tools in that they provide real-time feedback, so you can identify trends and act quickly without delay. They're great for informing decision-making and also backing up different resource allocations and just making sure that you are investing resources into the best areas. So as Caroline mentioned, the majority of perpetrators do attempt to conceal fraud by creating fraudulent physical documents or altering documents. This isn't surprising because physical documents are much easier to falsify and difficult to trace. This can be avoided by creating smart forms and automated workflows on your intranet. The workflows allow for multiple approvers across departments and roles and are auditable, so you will always have a record of employee activity. And here's a look behind the scenes. As you can see, it's super simple to turn a single form into a powerful process that allows you to securely collaborate with colleagues on your intranet. This also minimizes your risk exposure that results from sending personal information over email. So it just solves a lot of those problems. So here's a look behind the scenes. I'm just going to quickly go through that. So key to prevention, fraud prevention, is being aware of your policies. The challenge with policies is that they often live on a network and are typically or often read once during onboarding and never again. And obviously, that creates a lot of problems. By having your policies on your intranet, they're easily accessible and searchable to employees. You can share new policy updates in your newsfeed to ensure employees are made aware of any changes. And we also recommend making policies required reading on an annual basis for assurance that policies are being read and employees are aware of what is expected. Vendor fraud can also be committed by employees, and it happens either by employees acting alone or in collusion with a vendor. One way to prevent this is to publish a list of approved third-party vendors that employees are permitted to contract, so they're not, going out and kind of making up their own process there, and exactly who you're bringing in to work with the business, and there's no collusion going on. So anonymous reporting on your intranet is incredibly valuable as a fraud prevention tool, in that it provides a safe place for employees to bring issues forward while also allowing the business to manage issues internally. This information is also really valuable because you can look at reports over time to monitor trends and patterns in behavior to make more informed decisions. So it's obviously really important to tighten security. Many data breaches are the result of poor access control, which can be improved by baking data protection practices right into your day-to-day. You can set custom permissions on different pages and sections of your intranet to ensure employees have access to the information they need on a daily basis, while also restricting them from access that is maybe sensitive and confidential. We recommend running a sitemap report periodically to confirm who has access to individual sections and pages. The sitemap report provides, like at a glance, which permissions are applied to top and lower level pages. And this makes it really easy to identify potential red flags, such as inappropriate permissions. And it's really important to have a process in place should a security issue occur. Broadcast can be used to alert employees quickly via their mobile, email, or desktop application. So it sends a custom alert to all employees based on if you want to send it to everyone or just a small group. And it makes sure that your alert is not lost in someone's inbox. They're going to see it. You can be confident of that. We'd also recommend that you enable single sign-on. So if an employee is suspected of fraud, and maybe a fraud is, you've uncovered a fraud is in the process of being committed, you can easily disable access to everything. So you can make sure you cut off the source. And your intranet also offers the option to enable two-factor authentication. And I think we all understand or have experienced the annoyances of having to go through, texts and enter this access code. It's not enjoyable, but it's one of those necessary pains. So we do recommend you enable two-factor authentication. And building a positive culture is, I think we all understand the importance. It's not surprising that we've seen an influx in employee fraud cases in the last few years. Remote work has led to feelings of disconnect and dissatisfaction, which is evident in the degree of movement that we're seeing in the employment market recently. So you can build a positive culture by using your intranet to give employees a place to connect with others and build relationships. And it sounds so simple, but it's something that everyone struggles with. So I think any tools that you can use to make that easier, it's going to make everyone's lives better. So you can create shared interest groups like book clubs or cooking groups, run internal events and share them on your intranet, post blogs about people's personal stories, celebrate work anniversaries, welcome new employees as part of the onboarding process, and really just start engaging discussions. when an employee feels connected to their organization, they will be much less likely to rationalize fraud. Since culture is so closely tied to workplace fraud, it's important to regularly assess it on a consistent basis so you can effectively manage it. The survey function on your intranet makes it really easy to conduct regular pulse checks and put feedback loops in place so you can gain insight into what is working and where additional resources may need to be invested. In-app analytics allow you to benchmark survey results, and you can see how those survey results compare to similar organizations. But I think more importantly, engagement surveys really give employees a voice, which helps them to feel valued and appreciated, which really benefits everyone. So the reason this is important from a fraud perspective is because you can learn a lot about employees, just even based on their profiles and posting behaviors. If you're looking at, for example, if an employee has always been very active on the internet, has always engaged with other colleagues, and you see a decline in that engagement. Maybe you see an employee posting more content with more of a negative tone. Now, this doesn't mean that employee will go off and commit fraud. Absolutely not. But it is an opportunity to intervene and re-engage a potentially disengaged employee. So this is something that we really recommend everyone looks at. Get to know your employees, look at their profiles, look at their activity, just to make sure that you can intervene soon and just reach out to re-engage. So while all departments can leverage an intranet to prevent fraud, these are the roles that we see playing a really leading role. Internal comms teams can focus on boosting fraud awareness with consistent fraud content and also improving transparency by sharing information on corporate strategy, targets, and revenue. Human resource teams should really make fraud awareness a priority during onboarding to both educate new employees and send the message that there is a zero tolerance policy to fraud. Conducting regular pulse checks is also important, but it's even more important to communicate those results, to be transparent and really, share what that information is telling you and how you plan to actually put that into action. There's one thing to assess, but it's like, how are you going to act on it? And that really serves to build trust. And IT teams should closely manage permissions on an ongoing basis by running periodic site audit reports, just to ensure that appropriate levels are maintained. And with that, it looks like we're at questions.
This is great, Christy. I really love this idea. I feel like so many organizations will hire us to do training kind of once a year, and it's kind of done in an hour or two, forgotten about, but this is like the constant reminder, the constant engagement, the constant communicating and collaborating and sharing of information so that everybody is all on the same page. And, right away you're getting notifications of recent scams and things to watch out for. So I think it's a great idea.
Yeah, no, it's exciting because I think people are quite intimidated by fraud awareness and fraud prevention, right? It's a complex issue, but I think it's just about making, small changes to how you engage employees and communicate with them and share information. So it's definitely achievable.
We thank you very much, Christy and Caroline. That was a pretty amazing webinar, a few eye-opening statistics in there for sure. We are almost coming up on time. We do have a few questions to get to, Caroline. I see you answered one in line there. Thank you for that. So maybe we can just talk to you another couple of questions. If I don't get to your question, we will follow up for sure. Christy, maybe this one we can put to you. How do you ensure, or how do I ensure my intranet is secure?
I think, Caroline, that might be a good question.
Yeah. So I think it's definitely a good question, and you want to make sure that your, not just your intranet, but all of your IT security is in place. Like, you want to make sure that everything is secure at your organization. Think about where your most valuable assets are, and if they're electronic, if they're on a server somewhere, you want to protect them, including what's on your intranet. So there are ways that you can have sort of IT health checks done to see if you're doing all of the right things, and that's certainly something that Grant Thornton does offer. But if you have the right IT staff working for you as well, maybe that's something that they've been involved in. And for if you are getting your intranet, through somebody like ThoughtFarmer, if they're the organization that's helping you build out your intranet, there are audits that are required by these service organizations, these service providers, and there are audit reports. I think Christy, ThoughtFarmer has them, right? Where you get annual audits done, and you get a report saying that you passed the audit and you have all these right controls in place. So you want to make sure that you're checking that whoever's providing your intranet service, that they have these audit reports, the certification to say that they've been tested and they passed the tests on a regular basis. So again, this type of audit service is something that Grant Thornton provides, but it's something you want to be looking out for as well, making sure that you've done, you're engaging with organizations that have met those standards.
Yeah, and I think also making sure that employees are aware of your IT security policies and procedures. So unfortunately, a lot of the time, it's kind of employees who are sometimes putting the business at risk, including potentially the internet, right? So I think as much as we can educate our employees about best practices in terms of IT security, the better.
Definitely. We always say that your employees, your frontline staff are really, it's the human firewall, right? And definitely creating that awareness amongst everybody that really has access to your intranet, your email, your server. Like, these are the individuals that could be putting your organization at risk. So that training and awareness is key.
Sure.
Okay, cool. And I think we have time for one more question. We've got 2 minutes left. Do you recommend third-party providers for a whistleblower hotline? What are the pros and cons?
Yes, absolutely. We at Grant Thornton, we do offer a whistleblower hotline service. And what we've found really works well is that employees really put their trust. They're more likely to speak up if they know that they're going to remain anonymous, and they're not going to, if they suspect that their manager is stealing from an organization, they're less likely to say anything if they have to call somebody that works down the hall from them, or that knows the manager and works with the manager on a daily basis. If they can contact in a safe way, they can contact a third party, and they know how to access that, and they know they're going to be anonymous, they're much more likely to report a fraud, and then something can be done about it. So yes, absolutely, I would recommend that.
Okay, perfect timing. We're right on 10 a.m. in Vancouver. So Caroline, thanks so much again for presenting with us today. That was a stellar webinar for sure, lots of takeaways from it. To everybody still on the call, we will of course be following up with a recap email that will include links to today's recording, plus a few assets that Caroline and Christy mentioned throughout, like the ACFE report. So yeah, that should be in your inbox at some point tomorrow. And other than that, have a lovely rest of your day, and thanks for coming.
Great, thanks everyone.
Thank you so much. Thanks, bye.
Bye.